Pretty good line.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the weekly podcast. Back on it, the Ultimate Personal Training Podcast. So today we're going to be talking about some advanced training, hypertrophy and body compositions approaches that I've been using with my clientele recently. So I had a really good call today. Dylan from Mama Group talking about some of that stuff. He sent me a bunch of questions and I've got a ton of clients who are working on this as well. So just to talk about some of the approaches that I have may be useful for some people. Hopefully I can distill a little bit of wisdom out there, a little bit of an interesting idea on hypertrophy. So basically training to look better naked, let's call it what it is. So the first thing is with a client that I'm working with today, we're looking at changing the program in regards to goals. So looking at difference in training program. And this client has gone from a calorie surplus into going into a maintenance or a calorie deficit phase based on a few of the metrics that we're going to look at today. And then we're going to be shredding for a holiday, basically, get in shape for that, because on the holiday, you can eat whatever you want and just generally enjoy that holiday. So the question is, when's a good time to change a program? How long should someone stick to a program for? What things do you need to do to make sure you're getting the best outcomes? And first, the last thing is, have you sucked all the goals out of that program that you can do? So with that, the first thing that you want to do for hypertrophy is, if you want to set a time frame for a program based on the actual adaptations of the muscle cell. So what I mean by that is the old time frames for hypertrophy of like 4 weeks, and then you change exercises, is really not how our muscles adapt. Our muscles really take about a period of around 16 weeks to hit full myocyte maturation, which means the muscle cell gets to like basically its biggest and strongest capacity before we start seeing a decrement in force production, force output, and hypertrophy potential. So we start getting more of the catabolic signals such as AMPK rather than hypertrophic symbols like MTOR. So the first 2 weeks of a training program are generally neural in nature. So the adaptations are learning the movement patterns, learning force production, learning force summation, rate of force development, inter and intramuscular coordination. We're still getting some hypertrophy, but we're not getting much hypertrophy at that point. The adaptations, if we use a partitioning ratio, are going to be 80% neural, 20% muscular. So probably even less than that, to be honest, but they're not getting a lot there. With clients who don't want to gain muscle, that's actually a really good approach. Giving them highly varied workouts where it changes quite frequently can be really, really useful. You just need to make sure you don't change them frequently enough that they, get really, really sore and then they can't train. But that's a different discussion for another day. Now, the next so many weeks, in weeks 3 to 8, are kind of where we start working on increasing volume in our training program. So we increase our volume for our lifts, and we can do that through a number of mechanisms. We can increase the reps, we can increase the sets, we can increase the amount of weight we do. What I generally do is I add 1 set per week to a particular lift for a body part that person wants to emphasize. And what I do is I normally always work in rep ranges, let's say 8 to 12, and I make the client finish all the sets at all the sets at 12 before I allow them to increase the weight again. So we're always looking towards the higher end of that rep range, because higher end reps need more glycogen, and you get more glycogen upregulation to the skeletal muscle. Now, all these training phases of a 16-week hypertrophy program can have supplementation, PEDs, and nutrition approaches that work concurrently with that. The problem with that is application of it. It can be a lot to apply and a lot to do, but it's certainly something that we can look at doing. I'll probably talk about that later. From then weeks 8 to up to weeks 9 to 13, then we're looking at a lactic loading. So in that phase, what we do is we keep the sets where we are, but we start pushing as heavy as we can in those particular lifts. So at sets of say 8 to 12, we're going to aim for the heaviest weight we can do with 8. And then when we've done a set of 8, we're going to go a little bit heavier on the next week. See, if we fall below 7, that's okay. We want to push it back up to 8 the next week, and we want to constantly be pushing loading. So what's happening here is we're actually stimulating a higher level of muscle growth at this point. We've identified the muscle's full of glycogen. Now we're going to challenge its loading capacity, i.e. we're going to put as much force as possible throughout the fibers, and we're going to generate as high amount of intramuscular tension as we can. And that is one of the key components of hypertrophy. So what we need to do is we actually need to be patient enough to get to that 9-week point where we can really kick the tires out and add some load to it. And from there, weeks 13 to 16 is kind of like or 13 to 15 really, 16 should be a deload, are the key points of muscular hypertrophy where our myocytes, our muscle cells reach full maturation. So what we need to do is we destroy them with things like drop sets or myo reps or whatever, the fun type of training that all bodybuilding or hypertrophy training likes to be. So when you train like that, not only are you matching how a muscle grows, the muscle cell grows, which is the key thing that we're trying to develop, bigger muscle cells, we're matching what the process is. So if it's neural to glycolytic to alactic and then to myocyte maturation, we are training for that particular purpose the whole way through. Now, at the end of 16 weeks, this is when we have some choices that we can make in terms of a new training cycle. So if you want to have an emphasis on body parts shifted around, that's something that you do with frequency. We're more concerned with exercise selection. Now, the old rule of thumb that you need to change exercises every 4 to 6 weeks or they get stale isn't really the case here. In this situation, if you have lifts that you are still responding to really well, so you're getting really good pumps, your strength is going up gradually and consistently, you're not getting any tendon or joint issues, and you're still not hating lift, for lack of a better term, this is something that you can keep on pushing, okay? You can keep on going higher and higher with that. There's no reason not to. In fact, it's probably a really good reason to do that. So I would highly recommend that at that point, you keep those lifts in your program if that's something that you want to be doing. If it's, say, leg press and you're still going up and up, I would continue that. Now, how do we know when to pull a exercise out? Are we sucking at it? Are we hating it? Has our progress come to a grinding halt? And when I talk about progress coming to a halt, if something comes to a halt for 1 to 2 weeks, if you're anything beyond a beginner trainer, calm down, just relax a little bit. It's going to be okay. So we need to make sure that we're not being premature with our discarding of an exercise. If we've got joint and tendon pain, i.e. the pain kicks in after the exercise and lingers afterwards, so you got sore knees or whatever, then it's a good sign that you need to change your exercise. And that's one of the coolest things about doing this approach. You can change exercises out at different phases and keep other exercises in for longer. So you don't have to write an entirely new program. And this is something that, for me, I've kind of struggled with, not from an intellectual perspective, but more from like an adherence perspective. So looking at clients' motivation, I've worked with clients 20 years now. And in the past, lots of clients loved having their program changed every 4 to 6 weeks. It was something new, it was exciting, et cetera, et cetera. Now clients seem to want the program to last for 32 damn weeks. They're like, I love this program. It's the best program I've ever done. I'm really happy with it. Can I just keep going with it? Because they're still seeing progress. So there's nothing wrong with that. What we would do after 15 weeks, we would put 1 week deloading where we either do zero training or, just other stuff for a little week or really reduce the volume. There's multiple choices that you can do. There's really no kind of rule of thumb for that. And then from there, what we do is back into the program, go through the same progression of rep sets, etc., and then go through that same progress again, like glycogen upregulation, alactic loading, myocyte maturation. What some people struggle with at that point is because the volume will come down at the beginning of the program from, say, at the end, maybe 4 sets down to 2 sets. You'll be able to actually push harder on those sets as well with a new capacity. So you'll actually keep on progressing on those lifts that you're doing really, really well with. Really, really cool way to look at hypertrophy training. Now, a couple of considerations that we talked about there. Does the training change based on the nutritional goal? So if we look at training for a particular goal, or look at aiming for a particular goal, not look at training, generally the training programs can stay the same if you're looking for fat loss or muscle gain, if you're a body composition client, because what most clients are looking at is retaining as much muscle mass while losing as much body fat as possible. The difference in the training comes from the caloric output, the cardiovascular training, the non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and the deficit or the surplus caused by the calories that the client is eating. So if I have a client who's going through a calorie deficit, what will happen over the period of 16 weeks, yes, volume does increase, but generally that will also account for some increased output, so I can actually keep food at a higher level. So that's one way where that approach works really well when you're looking at doing a 16-week cycle for a fat loss program for someone. If someone's in the calorie surplus, it's fine. They can keep training hard because they get more food each week or every time their weight goes up to actually compensate for that. So in this situation, all you have to do is figure the same program applies. It's just like, how do you periodize the diet around that? But more importantly, not as importantly, how do you periodize the steps and how do you periodize the cardiovascular training to not have too big of an impact or be too much or too little? You need to hit that sweet spot for that. And you'll know that by rates of progress and how your clients are feeling. So if they're progressing well and they feel all right, good, you've hit the right mark. save it, use as little as you can until you get there. In terms of PED applications, because a lot of people ask me about PEDs and supplements now. With PED application, you'd really be looking at following the PED cycle based on what the goal is as well. Now, if you're following like a blast cruise cycle, you'd generally be looking at adding a blast in while you're trying to increase calories, and then cruise would be doing a deload in between. So the difference between that is your cruise phase length will be dictated by your health detriment during the course of the training program, and that's going to be entirely reliant on how well you tolerate drugs and how well you actually do all the other stuff that's required to take drugs, like what's your maintenance of your health, how you're monitoring it, how you're going with your health-based supplementation and your health-based behaviors. If you're following a longevity or a safer use model, it's not really going to make a difference to you one way or the other, because that safer use model is based around the use of human tested compounds that are approved for human use and are used clinically in long-term fashion. So if someone's on TRT, for example, they're not blasting their testosterone and pulling it off. They're just finding a baseline limit that they can tolerate or they feel really good on, and their score is really good, and they're just going to keep it going from there. In a basal use model, or the Victor Black, he popularized it, the safer use model, basically, you'd be pushing your testosterone up to a certain point where you feel really good. This is just a shoe thing, okay, something fancy. You push it up to a certain point and then you pull it down just below the point where you get side effects and you get no negative health consequences. So with that, basically, that's a really easy way that you periodize your drugs. You pick your approach, and your training won't dictate what your drugs are doing too much. It's kind of like what your nutrition goals and your body composition goals, and the training will stay the same. The last consideration I'll talk about is the application of cardiovascular training and other goals that will come into that. And this comes into health effects and like kind of how you feel. So with some of the clients I'm working with hypertrophy, because they're gaining a fair bit of weight, they're starting to feel a little bit chunky, starting to feel a little bit bigger, and not feeling anywhere near as athletic. Now, two things to consider. If their only goal is bodybuilding, part of the game. You will gain weight. It's what you're trying to do. So happy days. If you're trying to have a more well-rounded approach to health, not that that's good or a bad thing, okay? Just there's no moral value on this. If you're trying to have a more rounded approach to what you're doing, then you may want to implement some cardiovascular training to offset some of those things. So if you add cardiovascular training in a little bit higher volume when you're on a caloric surplus, you'll probably gain weight a little slower, but what will happen is you'll have a better partitioning ratio. So you'll have more relative muscle gain to relative fat because you've improved insulin sensitivity, you're improving endothelial function, you're improving parasympathetic tone by doing more cardio. There's a ton of benefits to that that are actually going to improve your body composition. The only thing we need to worry about is your scale weight will not climb as quickly, simply because you're doing some more output, which means you're not eating as much, and you're getting less body fat retention during the phase. So, you know, pretty good. This is why most bodybuilders keep a general amount of cardiovascular training in. It's for health markers, and then also to have some kind of consistency with their macronutrient calculations. If you're a client or a general population person who wants to feel better, absolutely a valid strategy to use. You won't lose muscle. The concurrent training effect or literature, you have to be doing a lot to really get a negative outcome. So we're not really going to worry about that. Adding in 2 sessions a week is not really going to cause as much of a drama as what you think. If you're burning like 200 to 300 calories a session, it's no big deal. There's not going to be any interference there. If you're on drugs, interference effect isn't something that you really need to worry about, because you've got a constant anabolic signaling stimulus going through to your muscles the whole time, particularly when caloric surplus. If you're on drugs, you can go muscle quite quickly in a calorie deficit as well, simply because you've got such a strong signal to grow muscle mass. So that's with hypertrophy. There's some of the advanced concepts that I work with my clients and that I'm happy to teach everyone about. There's things that we can add to that. So the periodization of nutrition and the actual periodization of looking at lengthened mid-range partial work, the changing the tempo and the execution of each exercise to facilitate better performance of all these things. And then looking at changing the exercise selection based on muscle bellies and presentation of the client. So tons of stuff there. Just want to touch on the 16-week myocyte cycle and how you can use that for hypertrophy training, and then how to build your next programming cycle based on what's actually going on with the client, which can give you a lot less work and keeps your clients a ton happier. So guys, thanks again for listening. I'll be back next week. See you soon.